and welcome to the Tudor Her Story and a very happy new year. Today I am welcoming back former guest Sophie Bacchus-Waterman to discuss her research on Anne Boleyn's mother of the maids, Mary Marshall. Sophie earned a Master's in Book History from the School of Advanced Study in 2023. Her dissertation focused on the commission of the Psalter of Anne Boleyn. She has 3 papers on her research into Anne Boleyn's Psalter and household forthcoming in the next year. She has spoken on her research at the Taylorian Institution in Oxford and at the 13th Annual Kings and Queens Conference in Paris, and appeared on the podcast Talking Tudors. Outside of her work as an independent scholar, she's the special collections photographer at St John's College in Oxford, where she digitizes their manuscripts and early printed books. Her forthcoming book, the first solo biography of Elizabeth Boleyn, is due out with the History Press at the end of this year. Let's delve into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Sophie. How are you?
I'm absolutely fine, thank you. Thanks so much for having me back.
No, it's a pleasure to have you back. I was very excited when you gave me a quick email to say what your idea was for tonight.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to, promote it a little bit more, the research, because I know that sometimes academic papers can go under the radar a little bit. And I just think it's such an exciting discovery. And obviously, I really enjoyed our conversation about Elizabeth last time.
So before we get on to our main lady, who is Mary Marshall, mother of the maidens for Queen Anne Boleyn. So before we get on to her, when did you first become interested in history and what drew you to Tudor history?
Yeah, so I've had an interest in history for a very long time, actually. As a child, we took a school trip to Kentwell, which was local to where I went to school, and I loved it. I remember everyone being dressed up as Tudor and just having so much fun. So I've always had an interest in Tudor history and history more broadly, but it was only fairly recently that it actually became more of a serious career path for me, which honestly happened by accident. I was doing my master's in book history because I wanted to sort of work in libraries and work with special collections and move in that direction. And then through that, did my dissertation on the Psalter of Anne Boleyn, a part of which has been published recently as a paper in the Papers for the Bibliographical Society of America. And the rest is due out in the Royal Studies Journal later this year. So was through the research into Anne's Psalter and Anne Boleyn more generally, I started to become much more interested in history as a career path and research as a career path outside of my job as a special collections photographer at St John's College in Oxford, which satiated sort of the interest in history on a practical level because I'm working with some really amazing manuscripts and early printed books and things like that. But yeah, the interest in history as a serious sort of academic pursuit is very recent for me.
The last time when you came on, you mentioned, and it was our main topic, that you are writing the first biography on Anne's mother, Elizabeth. How is that going? Are we going to see it published this year?
We are. It's going frighteningly well, actually. So the first draft is finished, completely finished, and it will be sent off to the publishers in a couple of days at time of recording. So we're in early January at the moment, so very soon. And then there's a whole bunch of steps before it hits the shelves. And I keep reminding myself that the messy first draft that is currently on my computer is not what will eventually be on shelves. It will be published this year, all being well. We're looking at an October publication at the moment. So very excited to be able to share more about that.
No, wonderful. I can't wait. So before we get on again to Mary, I thought you could tell us what is the role of the Mother of the Maidens, as maybe some people don't really know what the Mother of the Maidens is.
Sure. So a lot of people have, I think, quite a romanticized view of the ladies in waiting of the queens generally. The idea of, a bunch of women who sit around and maybe sew together, go watch jousts and, have fancy food and things like that, which obviously is true. But predominantly the ladies around the queen, and the term ladies in waiting is actually anachronistic. It's not a term they would have used at the time. More generally, the term ladies seems to have been more common. Their function was decorative, almost performative. They were there, beautiful young women around the queen, to enhance the queen's majesty and position at public events like funerals, weddings, christenings. They were there to accompany the Queen, um, to perform tasks for her and things like that. And at the head of them was the mother of the maids, whose job it was to make sure that the young maids in the Queen's service, the young unmarried women, behaved impeccably. The mother of the maids was somebody who was almost, I think of her like a school teacher, who
Mm.
was there for the young women to make sure that they behaved well, that their appearance was correct, that they didn't do anything unseemly. And yeah, the title Mother of the Maids is one of many. It's referred to in court documents in lots of different ways. Mistress of the Maids, Mother of the Maidens, Mistress of the Maidens. It's quite interchangeable in that way. But the job, it was, seems to have been one of keeping up standards in the Queen's household.
Did the mother of the maidens assist in the running of the Queen's household, or did they primarily focus on just the unmarried women, ladies?
They seem to have focused on the unmarried women and ladies, and also seem to have oh, I've lost track of thought. Sorry. Let me start that answer again. They do seem to have focused predominantly on the maids of the household. We don't have much direct evidence of what the job actually entailed day to day, unfortunately. But we've got William Latimer in his Chronicle of Anne Boleyn, who talks about the mother of the maids taking to task the young women in Anne's service when they misbehaved. And he does say specifically in the Chronicle that it was particularly focused on the young women, the maidens of honor is the term he uses. So it does seem like the role was focused around the young women in Anne's service, not perhaps the older women. As I say, sort of more of a teacher role.
Mm. So would the mother of the maidens directly work with the Queen? So whatever the Queen wanted in her household would be directly passed on to the younger ladies.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got, I can read you the quote actually from William Latimer because it really sums it up. I've got it right in front of me. So it says here that and that her ladies, maidens of honour, and other gentlewomen should use themselves according to their calling. Her grace would commonly and generally many times move them to modesty and chastity, but in especial to the maidens of honour, whom she would call before her in the privy chamber, and before the mother of the maids would give them a long charge of their behaviours. So in that, it seems like Anne and the mother of the maids, who at this time would have been Mary Marshall, Mrs. Marshall, were working in tandem to keep the household appropriate and genteel and respectable and all of the things that would have been expected of the Queen's household.
So moving on to Mary, was Mrs. Marshall initially your first topic to research, or did this discovery happen by accident?
I think, like a lot of really exciting discoveries, it happened completely by accident. I think it's one of those discoveries where if you'd gone looking for Mrs. Marshall, the identity of Mrs. Marshall as she's been known to history, you wouldn't have been able to find it if that was your undertaking. Because in the court documents, she is referred to as Mistress Marshall across the board. It is not in the typical places that you would find the name of Mrs. Marshall. She's only ever referred to by that title, which is why historians have referred to her as such, you know, forever, because that's all she's known as in court documents. It was only by accident that I came across her identity. Because of the biography of Elizabeth Boleyn that I've been writing, I use the old Google Books method, where you Boolean search a whole bunch of keywords and see what comes up. And it was a particular early modern spelling, I believe it was of the Countess of Wiltshire, that's what I was searching for, which was Elizabeth Boleyn's title from 1529, that led me to the transcribed will of William Marshall, who was Mary's husband. And then from that, was able to download the will from the National Archives website, read it, and then see that he mentioned his wife, Mary. And also in the will, so he mentions in the will Elizabeth Boleyn, the Countess of Wiltshire. And so then you know, well, this William Marshall knew Elizabeth Boleyn. And his wife was Mary Marshall, that therefore likely means that his wife was the Mrs. Marshall of Anne Boleyn's household because of that connection between Elizabeth Boleyn and the Marshall
Mm.
family. So that's how I did it by accident. Couldn't have done it if I'd gone searching for it.
I mean, it's a random thing to stumble upon, but isn't it a little interesting thing to stumble upon as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's one of those things where you don't realize how invisible she's been. Because I thought, I wonder if this is no. When you first make that discovery, you look into it and go, no, she is only referred to by historians and in contemporary documents as Mrs. Marshall in Anne's household. So when you make that connection between the Marshall family and the Boleyn family and realize this is the name, the identity of Mrs. Marshall, and then you can start to build out her biography, because then you have the name of her husband, you've got the name of her children, all from her husband's will. You find out a little bit more about the Marshalls of Bedfordshire, and so was able to flesh out a woman that had only otherwise been just a name. Because you could never find the biographical information of Mrs. Marshall because it is an anonymizing name.
Mm. How did you begin, once you found this will, how did you
Mm.
begin to build on this and start researching Mary properly?
Well, with the will, wills are amazing resources, I think, sometimes overlooked, but they can tell you so much about an individual. Because of William Marshall's will, which is freely downloadable on the National Archives website, I was able to, as I say, find the name of her husband, the name of her children. He referred to himself as William Marshall of Dunstable Priory. So that's in Bedfordshire. So that gives you a location. And from there, you can look and see if there were any other Marshalls in Bedfordshire that predate the William Marshall of the will.
Mm.
And so then you have, a little bit of a family tree. Then you've got a little bit about William Marshall, was able to research him. Obviously, a lot easier to research a man than it is to research a woman during this time period. And so I was able to find that he was a lawyer. You can flesh out the family by looking into the names of the children. So unfortunately, the information about Mary Marshall as an individual outside of her family was scant. I couldn't find her maiden name, couldn't find what she did after Anne Boleyn's execution, or whether she, went on to get other work, or kind of what her life became afterwards, after she left the Queen's service. So there is still further research to be done. The
Mm.
point of the paper that was published late last year was really just to alert other historians to her existence and say, now we know her, we know her name, someone else can pick up this torch and look into her more and hopefully fill some of the gaps that I wasn't able to fill.
So going into Mary's family tree a bit more, what did you find in Mary's family tree? Is it just her and her husband onwards, or were you able to find before Mary as well?
A little bit before Mary as well. So I was able to find that William Marshall, her husband, was the son of Joan and John Marshall, and they married in 1476 after Joan was widowed. And then she was deceased by 1487, and then was able to find that there had been a Marshall family in Bedfordshire for quite some time. Wasn't able to go any further back than that. But then you've got the Marshalls as far back as the 14th century, who possibly may have been a distant relative of William Marshall. So there seemed to have been a Marshall family in Dunstable for quite some time.
Hmm.
We've got another William Marshall in 1454. And then we've got a Thomas Marshall mentioned in 1427. There seems to have been an Edmund Marshall around in 1430. So quite a lot of the family, if they are all of the same family,
Mm.
then there seems to have been a Marshall family in the area for several generations.
So do we have much documents surrounding Mary in Anne Boleyn's court, or is it quite limited?
There's a few. So she first turns up in the New Year's gift roll of 1534, which lists that she received plate from the king. So she was there. So she was there as early as January 1534. And then again, we've got a mention in a letter from a Dominican friar named John Hilsey to Thomas Cromwell on the 16th of October. And he refers to her as Mrs. Marshall, mistress to the Queen's gentlewoman. And then there's a reference, what's possibly the last reference, on the 20th of May, the day after Anne Boleyn's execution, in 1536, when Thomas Cromwell writes a note to remember the mistress of the maids. And that possibly is Mrs. Marshall. We don't know because he doesn't mention her by name. Because we don't see someone else in that role until 1539. So it's probable, at least my theory is, that Cromwell was making a note to himself to remember the mistress of the maids, possibly to tell her that she was dismissed, as lots of Anne Boleyn's household were. We don't know why Cromwell wrote that note.
No.
So there's a few mentions of Mary in the Queen's service. And then, of course, you've got the mentions not directly by name, like the one by Cromwell, and also Thomas Latimer mentioning in the Chronicle of Anne Boleyn that I read earlier as well. So not by name, but you can look wider at where the role is mentioned.
Right. Obviously, I know you mentioned Elizabeth Boleyn being in William Marshall's will.
Yes.
So do we not have Mary's will? Is that just not non-existent to us?
Wasn't able to find it. It would be amazing if we did. I couldn't find her will, unfortunately, nor could I find the wills of her children either, which again would have been particularly useful. But no will from her, unfortunately.
Did William, her husband, work in the Tudor court?
I wasn't able to find him either. So William and Mary had a daughter called Elizabeth Brocas, whose husband was probably John Brocas, who worked in the king's household for a time. But I wasn't able to find William Marshall either. There was a brief strand of research that I went down suggesting that the William Marshall of the Marshalls of Bedfordshire was the same William Marshall who worked for Thomas Cromwell for a time, but that doesn't seem to have been the case either. Two different Marshalls, quite a common name.
Oh, right, okay. Would you say you would do further research on Mary to discover more, or do you think someone else should start to do a bit more as well?
Oh, I would love to. If I had the time, with the book coming out and then several other papers I'm working on, yeah, I think possibly. I think there's definitely more scope. It'd be wonderful if we could find out more about Mary. I needed to keep the paper quite streamlined and basically just say this is what we know about the family so far. So I'd love to do more research. I think finding her maiden name would open up a lot of avenues because I was only able to trace the history of the Marshall family because I didn't have her maiden name. So if we could have her maiden name, then that would open up a lot more doors, or possibly kind of follow her career after she left Anne Boleyn's service, because she seems to have, after Anne Boleyn's execution, not stayed on, because as I say, we don't see someone in the role of Mother of the Maids until 1539, and that was Mistress Stoner. So if Mary Marshall got the position because of her connections to Elizabeth Boleyn, which seems to have been likely because Elizabeth Boleyn knew the Marshall family, then she probably left the royal service after Anne Boleyn's execution. So finding her further career would be great.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you say, yeah, a lot of the people that served Anne just either left court or decided to not return when asked as well.
Yes,
Which
and it's possible that that she didn't want to, or she wasn't asked, or we just don't know.
No, it's just hard to fill in gaps, isn't it? Sometimes when there's such little evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know who was the Mother of the Maids during Jane Seymour's queenship, for example, because we don't see someone in that role, like I say, for a couple of years. So it would be great to know who had that role at other times as well. I was able to find the name of the Mother of the Maids, two other women who served in the same position during other queenships. So you've got Mistress Stoner, who seems to have remained in the role from 1539 to 1545, which meant that she served under Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. And then you've got Mother Lowe, who was the mother of the Dutch maids specifically under Anne of Cleves, which makes sense because Anne of Cleves' household was obviously divided between the English maids who would have been under the care of Mistress Stoner, and then those who came over with Anne of Cleves were under the care of Mother Lowe, who also
Right.
seems to have come over with Anne of Cleves. So, you know, there's examples of people in this role across the board during the Tudor period. But we don't, for example, know who held the role in Catherine of Aragon's queenship or Jane Seymour's queenship. It would be really good to know that. And I think further research, I wasn't able to find the evidence. That
No.
doesn't mean it's not. It doesn't mean it's not there. You know, it's possible that the names of the women who served in the position under other queens are out there somewhere.
Would you say being a mother of the maids was an important role in the Queen's household?
I think so. I think um, because you were in charge of discipline and image upkeep, I suppose, is a way to put it, then it must have been an important role. I wish we knew more about how people got the position. I think it probably had to do with connections. You know, if we assume that Mary Marshall knew Elizabeth Boleyn, and then Elizabeth Boleyn seems to have had a hand in positions in Anne's household, then it's probably through that social connection that Mary got the role. She must have had the women who served that role must have proved themselves in some way, I would imagine, completely speculating now, possibly because they had their own children, because it is a role that requires taking care of young women. So she must have had something about her that lent to that position. It doesn't seem to be one where you rise up in the ranks in the Queen's household. You know,
Mm.
we don't see Mary, or as far as I know, anybody else, as a lady in waiting and then becoming a mother of the maids. It seems to have been an entry level position, to put it in
Yeah.
modern to put it in modern terms.
I mean, I was gonna say, would you have had to have had previous experience? Obviously being a mother is quite motherly.
Mm-hmm.
But would you have had to have a previous role in the Tudor court to become mother of the maids?
I think that's a really good question. I wasn't able to find evidence of Mary in the court records prior to her being mentioned in 1534, but I haven't looked more widely. I think it would be very interesting to see if there are instances of women who are at court or known at court prior to entering the service in that way. It's possible.
What did you enjoy the most about researching Mary and putting this paper together?
I think that it was just so exciting to realize that this was a person who had been unknown to history before. To be able to find the name of her husband, the name of her children. I wasn't able to find exactly where they lived, but like I say, you know, Bedfordshire, which is probably, by the way, how they knew the Boleyns. The
Mm.
Boleyns having a property in Luton Hoo, they must have been close enough by, with the Marshalls living in Dunstable Priory. So to be able to uncover facts about her life once it was definite that this was the Mrs. Marshall of Anne Boleyn's household, and that to have her go from the name Mrs. Marshall and nothing else, to be able
Mm.
to say her name was Mary, her husband's name was William, they lived in Dunstable Priory in Bedfordshire, she served the Queen from this date to this date, was very exciting. It felt like I was finding a whole person. And I think, you know, when you're thinking about women in this period in particular and how much they've been anonymized, um, or are very hard to find in the records, it felt incredibly special and quite moving to uncover what I could about this woman's life, really. The
I
whole thing.
mean, yeah, obviously, as you were saying earlier, there's so many women that go unrecorded in history or just known by their surname. But to think again more of like Anne's household, you're getting a name, like a full name to someone
Mm-hmm.
that for like 400 odd years that you'd have like, yeah, it's just Mrs. Marshall. But now we know
Yes,
who she is to some level, even if we
yes.
don't know her daily ins and outs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think there's more scope, there's more possibility, like I say, for further research into family connections, perhaps between the Marshalls and the Boleyns, which was also a key aspect of the paper as well, in proving the links between the Boleyn family and the Marshalls of Bedfordshire. And they seem to have known each other since the mid-15th century. There's evidence of that. So there's probable research can be done to flesh out the connections between the Marshalls and the Boleyns. Like I say, Mary's life before her marriage, after Anne's execution, perhaps looking into the lives of their children. There's definitely more scope for that to be done. But I think there's something that was particularly exciting about the paper as well, is Elizabeth Boleyn's role in it, because it gives tangible evidence that Elizabeth Boleyn knew the Marshall family, and Mrs. Marshall being in Anne Boleyn's service strongly suggests that Elizabeth Boleyn had a hand in gaining women positions in Anne Boleyn's household, suggesting that Elizabeth Boleyn's role may have been more significant during Anne Boleyn's queenship than we've perhaps allowed because of a lack of evidence. So I think from like a more academic, less emotive point of view, then it was very exciting to kind of look at the women in the Queen's household and how Elizabeth Boleyn may have had a function in getting women into positions in Anne's household, suggesting this particular woman for this position, and perhaps others, though we don't have the same evidence of that. And then on a more emotive level, it was just very nice to kind of restore this woman's name to her that had been lost to history, and a little bit about her family.
Can listeners access this article?
Yes, absolutely. It is behind the paywall, but I have several free e-prints that I'm happy to share with anybody who wants to. So, I'm no longer on Twitter. I've left, but I'm on Blue Sky. So anyone who wants to read it, get in touch and I will send a link. I know that you've read it, Jess.
Yeah.
And yeah, that the more people read it, the better. I think, I want to get the research out there. I want to talk about the documents that were used to evidence it, to be able to share the names, because the more people that know about it, the easier more research is done. It just facilitates more research. And it was very exciting. It's a little personal achievement of mine to see that it was that on Wikipedia somebody has gone to the trouble of changing what was Mrs. Marshall on the entry for the mother of the maids as a role in the English royal court to Mary Marshall. And seeing that was done was a very powerful moment, because it's restoring someone's name, it's restoring someone's identity that had been lost, as you say, for 400 years. And now, because we know her name, and because we know her husband and her children's name, and the family and where they lived, further research hopefully can be done into her and possibly other women in this role as well.
No, absolutely. And I think it's incredible that that kind of work is starting to be done on the lesser known roles and people of the Tudor court. And I think it's just important as well.
Completely agree. I think it was Laura Mackay who said in her introduction on her biography of Thomas Boleyn that people would be forgiven for thinking that the Tudor court consisted of about 6 people. You've got like Henry, whichever wife is currently in situ, Thomas Wolsey, Cromwell. That's about it, really. but there were hundreds and hundreds of people, and obviously some of them are unrecoverable. Some of them are only known by their names. There's still a lot of debate around who Mistress Stoner was, the other woman in the position of Mother of the Maids. She could have been one of, I think it's 2 people off the top of my head. So, yes, some people are unrecoverable, but it is so exciting that the more research and focus is being placed onto the lesser known figures of the court. Because if you love this period, and if you love the people who lived it, then yeah, it's not all about the histories of the great men, the histories of the men who made the policies. And of course, new research needs to be done all the time into people like Wolsey and Cromwell, and it's amazing. And the discovery of Cromwell's Book of Hours recently was just incredible. That's fantastic. But at the same time, research being done into these overlooked figures or understudied figures, you just don't know what it's going to uncover when you go to look. And I think that it's very touching in a way that I went looking for Elizabeth Boleyn, an overlooked woman in history, and then actually stumbled across two women. And then completely by accident was able to find Mary Marshall as well.
No, I mean it is absolutely incredible, and I think the article is wonderful as well, and I think it does open the scope to discover Mary more, find more about Mary. But I also think it might open a connection more into Elizabeth as well. Like, did she know the family really well? Can we find more into that?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, just, asking the right questions and you go looking and by accident find something that's really exciting. And that's where the history begins. It's just by accident. You trip and stumble over something and then say, okay, what can this lead to? And that's where the research was into the Marshall family, into Mary and William's children, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely more scope for more research. I just hope that people are as excited about it as I am.
Before I let you go, I always ask my guests five fun Tudor questions, as you know, as
Okay.
you've answered questions before, but I've given you some new Tudor questions. So, firstly, if you could go back to any day in the Tudor period, what day would it be?
It's got to be Anne Boleyn's coronation. I know it's so cliche, but I would love to see that. The descriptions sound incredible with all of these pageants and all of the celebrations. It was such a triumphant day. I think it would be lovely to see it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
definitely
know.
be one of the crowds there.
It is one
Yeah.
of the musts. Can you go back to the coronation, please?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a happy one, isn't it? There's something grim about like, oh, I'd go back to the execution of such and such a figure. You'd want to go back to a happy period, wouldn't you? To something
Yeah.
where something exciting was happening. Coronation of Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. That would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, that'd be a really good one as well, actually.
Yeah.
If you had to research just one Tudor figure for the rest of your career, who would it be?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. Oh gosh, I can't say Anne because I've actually made Anne a very small part, or tried as much as I can to make Anne a very small part of my biography. It's got to be Perkin Warbeck
Oh,
because I I think that the mystery around who he was and around, his life before he turns up on the scene in 1491, just there's so much there, to uncover and to talk about and discuss. I find the whole mystery of the Prince in the Tower fascinating and the whole Pretenders story just really interesting. So there is what I'd say.
that's an intriguing one, actually.
Yeah, difficult question though, because there are lots of people that spring to mind.
I mean, I think I could answer it, but I like to
You
ask
don't
others. I
you
don't know
don't
if
think you could answer it?
no, it most likely would be Anne, probably,
Would it
but
be Anne? Yeah.
it,
Mm.
it's cliche. It would have to be Anne, I think, most likely,
Yeah.
but
No, I completely agree. I think there's so much, more that we're still finding out about Anne. I think she's amazing and fantastic, and she's so many people's gateway into history. It's Natalie Dormer on the Tudors, and suddenly everyone's in love. But um, yeah, I don't know. Maybe Anne as well. I don't know. It's an impossible question to answer. But yes, I do have a particular love for the mystery of the Prince in the Tower and the Pretender.
if you could be any Tudor figure for a day, who would it
Mhm.
be?
Henry VIII, because what was going on in his head? It's got to. You just want to know, don't you? What was it like for a day to be Henry VIII? It must have been a strange headspace to be in, I would imagine. But yeah, it's got to be Henry. It would just be nice as well, to just have people at your beck and call and have lots of nice clothes and food and things on a very kind of basic level.
What
What
decade
about
would
you?
you pick for Henry? What decade?
It's got to be early, isn't it? Early Henry VIII, when everything was very exciting and new and he was young and vigorous and handsome and doing sports every day. And yeah, it's got to be kind of the 15 teens, I think,
Mm,
for Henry.
when he looked relatively normal.
When he looked normal and before he, had his dreadful accident and when everyone thought that he was wonderful and yeah, the world really kind of lay at his feet then, I think. Yeah,
I mean, fair. I
15
don't
teens.
blame you. I think I'd want to be a lady in waiting to like watch everything from the wall. Just be like a
That's
fly on
much
the
safer.
wall.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a much safer answer to just be a fly on the wall in so many of the interesting conversations. Yeah, that makes sense.
Which Tudor figure would you invite to a dinner party and why?
Oh, I think I'd want to invite Thomas Cromwell just because I think he'd be a really good conversationalist,
Hmm.
and I'm sure that he'd just have so much, so much to say. I think his life before serving the king was so interesting. You'd get a really good balance of the life of a relatively ordinary subject in the Tudor period, while also the closeness of um, his relationship to Henry and his time at court and all of that. Plus, I'd really want to know how involved he was in the downfall of Anne Boleyn. That's the question, isn't it? What was going on with Cromwell and the downfall of Anne Boleyn? So if it was a dinner party that you could ask anything and there were no repercussions, I would say, tell me what was going on, please. I really want to know.
Have your recorder at the ready, pen in the other
Exactly.
hand. What's going on? And finally, have you got a favourite history fact?
I think my favorite history fact to kind of go off the back of the conversation that we've been having is that there's always more to find out.
Hmm.
When I started looking into Elizabeth Boleyn, I thought there's probably not enough here for biography, and now it's about to be sent off to the publishers. And through the research into Elizabeth Boleyn, I was able to find Mary Marshall. There's also other discoveries about Elizabeth, myths that were debunked through the writing of the book. For a figure who is so invisible in the records, who is so difficult to see, who I'm sure a lot of listeners, a lot of potential readers, when the book comes out, will not have thought about much.
Hmm.
But just by looking, there's always something there, even if it's just a little bit, even if it's just enough for an academic paper on Mrs. Marshall, whose name we didn't know. I think my favorite history fact, and maybe it's not a fact in a traditional sense, it's more just something that I found to be true, that when you start to go looking for things, you will probably find something and overturn myths or uncover somebody's name or bring a figure to light who hasn't been studied much. So I'd say maybe it sounds a bit, I don't know, soapboxy, but that probably is my favorite history fact, that it isn't static, that it constantly changes. You think people think that history is something that happened in the past, and of course it is. On a practical level, that's what it is. But also, it is something that happens now.
Yeah.
When you look at the documents, when you question received wisdom, when you find new figures, because Mary Marshall's name was always Mary Marshall. It's just that we didn't know it.
Yeah.
It's just that by finding it, you then pull it up. So when other historians have called her Mrs. Marshall, they weren't wrong. That's all we knew. Her name was Mrs. Marshall, but now we know her name was Mary.
Yeah.
The history remains the same, but how we access it, the questions we ask, that's what changes. It's just by rediscovering and questioning, researching, it always changes. So I think that's probably my favorite fact of history.
No, I completely agree. I think you can have something really small like a name or a first name or where they were born, and you can just build and build as much as you can, obviously.
Absolutely. Or you've got discoveries, the discovery of Mary Queen of Scots letters that happened
Mm.
a couple of years ago, the rediscovery of Thomas Cromwell's Book of Hours that was just so exciting. Portraits are being renamed all the time. New discoveries are being made all the time. It doesn't change. It always, sorry, it doesn't stay the same. It always
Mm.
changes through new discoveries, through further research. It does not stay stagnant. I think that's just very exciting.
Thank you so much for coming back on to
Of
discuss
course.
Mary Marshall. I've had a blast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. It was so exciting. I've, loved talking about it. Loved chatting to you about all of this. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode and you loved all the others, please take the time to rate and review the show.